the midnight lake.
And we are homeless, hopeless, homeless, Papa.
Moonlight sleeping on the midnight lake.
And we are homeless, hopeless, homeless, Papa.
Moonlight sleeping on the midnight lake.
Kisiyoya,
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 Kisiyoya, Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya, Angulala
Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya, Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya,
Kisiyoya, Angulala
Kisiyoya,
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 Kisiyoya, Kisiyoya,
Strong wind, strong wind,
destroy our
strong wind,
many dead tonight it could be.
strong wind,
Strong wind, destroy our
strong wind.
many dead tonight it could be.
We are homeless, we are homeless.
Moonlight sleeping on the midnight lake.
Somebody sing.
Jambo, brothers and sisters, good evening. You are watching The African Perspective, a program of the African Cultural Development Association, ACDA. I am your host, Tacuma Ogunseye. Tonight I have in the studio with me Dr. David Hinds, and we will be discussing the issue of power sharing in Guyana. Before we go to the main discussion, I want to take the opportunity on the behalf of ACDA to welcome and to say our best wishes to the people of Kokwani, who not too long ago was engaged in protests to make their voices heard on matters that they feel are important to the survival of the community. We also want to salute the citizens of Georgetown who came out despite the weather and protest against the power company. We do believe that all of these actions of people's protests are important actions in strengthening the political culture of the country. We will now go to an ad break, and when we return, we will engage in this important discussion on power sharing in Guyana.
Now that you've tried the rest, come and try the Caribbean's best in photo processing at Presidency Enterprise. With our own state-of-the-art and advanced photo system equipment, Presidency Enterprise can produce classic and enlarged prints with special effects optional. Our experienced, qualified, and efficient staff will treat you courteously in our pleasant atmosphere. Our services include instant passport pictures, photo studio, laminating and photocopying, selling of Kodak and Konica films, cameras, batteries, Walkmans, video and audio tapes, telephones, albums, household and gift items. Presidency Enterprise has 3 locations: 118 Cowan Street, Kingston, telephone 77100 and 77300, 9 America and London Streets, telephone 77802, and 94 Regent Street, telephone 60814. Presidency Enterprise, the affordable shop where customer satisfaction is guaranteed.
Lead to the national park as the African Cultural and Development Association ACDA presents the African Emancipation Festival, featuring local and international groups, children's fun center, folk games, and prizes galore for best African wear. Music by popular DJs and big bands. Adults $500, children $100. Come and enjoy a truly African fun day. Don't you miss it.
Hey you! Yes, you! Looking for that needed cash? Then remember the name Luther's. Yes, Luther's Worthy Cause Pawn Shop is always willing to help you. We accept as collateral gold jewelry, electrical appliances, motorcycles and other vehicles. Also, remember to walk with valid receipts for all electrical appliances, Motor vehicle documents must be updated, and you must have a valid passport, identification card, or other forms of identification. Come visit our locations at Lot VV Durban Street or 27 Public Road, Vigilance, 4 houses from Vigilance Police Station. Telephone numbers 070-1581-61542. We offer longest payback periods and unbeatable interest rates.
Located at Regent and King Streets. Sewing World for fabric paste, Sewing World for elastic threads, Sewing World for fabric paints, Sewing World for wedding materials, Sewing World for crochet threads, Sewing World for shoulder pads, Sewing World for fabric transfers, Sewing World for tie-dye fabrics, Sewing World for buttons, buckles, and beads. Sewing World Streets opposite the Acme Photo Studio. It's Sewing World.
Once again, welcome to the African Perspective. Tonight, we're discussing power sharing. And as I said before, I have a very distinguished guest, Dr. David Hinds, in the studio. Dr. Hinds is a doctor in political science. But tonight, I'm going to emphasize not the doctor, his academic qualifications. I'm going to emphasize his political contribution to the country, because I do believe that what qualifies him to speak on this matter more than his academic credentials is his over 20 odd years of political struggle in the country. David Hinds was very active in the 1979 rebellion, which was led by Walter Rodney and the WPA. He participated in every important aspect of that struggle. He was not only a speaker at public meetings, he was one of our most important artists, cultural artists. Read poetry of rebellion, acts in various plays trying to emphasize the importance of the political messages. And when he was called to make a very high sacrifice for liberation of the Guyanese people, he answered the call, and as a result of that, he was put in prison by the Burnham dictatorship for 3 years, accused of bringing into the country weapons to overthrow the government. Dr. Hinds, as a result of that, spent 3 years in prison. And I do believe that he is very qualified politically to engage the nation on this important and sensitive issue. For the last 10 years or so, he has been living in the United States of America, studying as a student, and he qualified in the process. But on a day-to-day basis, he remained in contact with the political situation in Guyana, and he argued his views, and he tried to represent the best in Guyanese political culture, not only as a member of the WPA, but as a member of the African Guyanese community, a young leader in the African Guyanese community, trying to use his understanding of the world to force us to do something to liberate our country and ourselves. I think with that introduction, I want to welcome Mr. Hinds to the African Perspective, and I want to take this opportunity to alert our viewers that our program tonight will be very political. Mr. Hinds is in Guyana to honor an undertaking he gave to the WPA that he would come and do a talk on race and power sharing in Guyana. And that activity was held yesterday at the Tower Hotel. And I think it was a significant success. David, I want to ask you, very quickly, are you satisfied with the participation in the discussion? Do you believe, from what you have seen, is there hope?
Yes, I'm invigorated, so to speak, by the participation yesterday in the activity. I was most heartened by the participation by members of the audience. And all day today, the manager at Rodney House, Mr. Desmond Trotman, called me tonight and asked me if I can make copies of the talk I presented available to the center, because he had a number of calls yesterday inquiring about the paper and inquiring as to what we can do as a follow-up to the discussion we had yesterday. So I am extremely pleased and I'm invigorated by the kind of hope that I saw expressed yesterday at the symposium on race and power sharing. And I think it's a fitting tribute to Walter Rodney. Yeah.
Okay, I'm very happy for that. I want to start by, asking you to reflect about 16 to 17 years ago. I remember in 82, myself and Godfrey Sage was coming into the prison to do our stint of jail service, and you were about to come out. I think they brought you down from Mazaruni, and you was in Georgetown, and I think you had a few weeks, to come out. Okay, that's a long time. I just want to ask you, what are your reflections about that period, very quickly?
I know it's one of the periods of my life that I'm extremely proud of. Yeah? I'm proud that I made a sacrifice in whatever small way towards the liberation of our people. Liberation is an ongoing process, and I think that each generation, each human being must have some cause for which he or she must live. And I decided to become part of the struggle for liberation at that time, and I'm proud that I made the sacrifice. And now, almost 20 years later, when I look around and I see that we have gotten rid of that period of authoritarianism, I feel satisfied that I, and along with others like yourself, and made those ultimate contribution to that process. Of course, like I said, the work is an unfinished work. It's a work that must go on. And I have made a pledge that I would try as much as possible to contribute to that process. For me, that period of imprisonment, that period of intense struggle, was a period of coming of age. I think I became a man. I became someone who understands that this world is a place in which we are not islands, that we are part of a larger collective, and that each of us must make some contribution one way or the other. And it made me conscious that some of us have tools that others may not have, and that we ought to use those tools to help in the collective fight for freedom.
Okay, I want us now to begin our discussion proper on power sharing. The issue of power sharing have been an issue which seems to be of, it's long in the Guyanese political discourse. At different historical points, it become more and more important. Throughout my long political career experience in Guyana, I think at this point in time, the wide variety of social forces that have came out in support of power sharing during the constitutional reform process is extremely important, and I think it's historical in many ways. I think that it was only the PPP and the PNC as major forces that didn't speak on power sharing during the constitutional reform process. Having said that, I want to give you an opportunity to define for our viewers what is your understanding or your interpretation of power sharing, and why you believe that power sharing is critical to the country's political life at this stage.
Yeah, and my definition of power sharing will not be a straight power sharing means this or so. I want to outline something. My championing of power sharing arises from my reading of the concrete situation in our country. I think part of the debate on power sharing has missed the mark precisely because people view this thing as something that is abstract. I want to talk about power sharing as something that is part of the concrete experiences of Guyana at this particular juncture in our history. I think our country has reached the stage where it has come to the crossroads. It has come to a standstill. Because, as you would say, Ogun, the contradictions are playing themselves out in a very serious way in this country. And one of those contradictions is the whole question of race and power. Power sharing. Power is important in Guyana. Unfortunately for a small country, but the fact of the matter is that in third world countries, in countries like Guyana, power becomes important, political power. Hence, any debate, any conversation about what's going on in the country must deal with the question of power. Okay? Now, we live in a society that is divided along racial lines. Indians and Africans have historically competed against each other. In the post-colonial era, when we got independence, that competition became a competition for power. So one cannot separate political power in the country from the racial competition. Now, this struggle for power is taking place within the context of us sharing a geographical space, sharing this thing that we call Guyana. So we live in Guyana, and we are competing for power in this Guyana. If there are various races in the country, and power is a real issue, and we're sharing the same space, then it's logical that at some point we have to talk about how are we going to deal with this question of power in a way that satisfies all the different groups. And so therefore, my conception of power sharing is within that context, that we have experimented with a system that allowed one race group to hold political power. For 28 years, the PNC held it, ostensibly in the name of Africans. Since 1992, the PPP has held it, ostensibly in the name of Indians. And we've experimented with that thing where one group holds it for a time and the other group, and it hasn't worked. In the sense that when Africans were in power, Indians did their very best to undermine that African government. And now that the Indian government is in power, Africans are doing the same thing to undermine. Now this is a natural outgrowth of multiracial society and the competition for power. So power sharing for me must be seen within that context. If we agree that we want to live in this space as a nation, if we agree that we want to live here as Guyanese, if we want to agree that Africans and Indians and Amerindians and Portuguese and Chinese and the mixed races will pool our resources together and hold this thing together as a nation, then we've got to talk about how we will deal with the question of power. Now, it is well established that Africans in this country are not going to accept Indian leadership, political leadership. And Indians are not going to accept African political leadership. And Amerindians and the other races ought not to accept the kind of domination and chauvinism that Africans and Indians have demonstrated historically. So that therefore everything that has happened in our post-colonial experience and even before points to this whole question of dealing with power and how is it that we are going to distribute this power. How is it that we're going to share this power? How is it that we're going to create a political regime in which Africans and Indians and all the other races feel comfortable living side by side with each other? It is obvious to anyone that African and Indians get along very well once they're away from this whole question of power. We work with each other, we sell and buy and so on from each other. But politics is just below that. And once politics enters the equation, then we see two different animals. Okay. They're at each other's throat.
Okay, I think you've made the point. Very well put. Okay, you and I know, and I guess the majority of our viewers understand this reality of politics. Okay, we may have the right theoretical ideas, but ultimately it is human beings who have to put or not put these ideas into practice. I believe that in those of us who are committed to power sharing, I think we have won the ideological war for power sharing. I think the TUC, the Bar Association, almost all the political parties, all the important groups, the churches, the Human Rights Association, go down Starbuck News, all the progressive institutions in this country have come around to power sharing. The problem is that despite this vast collective strength of opinion for power sharing, this collective opinion don't have the political control to implement power sharing. And it ultimately writes down to those who have power. You're a political scientist. You're also a person who have been engaged in the practical politics of the country. You know the personalities. And I want to start with the People's Progressive Party leadership. What is your assessment of that leadership at this point in time and its willingness to make the necessary historic compromise for us to have power sharing, become a reality?
I think the PPP's leadership at the moment is perhaps the weakest leadership that the party has had over the years. And I say that emphatically because I've observed the PPP, studied the PPP, and all political parties are false. But I think this has been the least progressive leadership that the party has had. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that, Ogun. We live in a small society where what comes with political office and political power is the spoils of office. And people's involvement in politics have over the years become attached to the spoils of office. So that involvement in politics, it is not driven by a need to work with your people, on behalf of your people, to lift the standards and the collective standard. It is driven by the need to be in office, the need to have the grandeur of office, the need to have access to state funds, the need to drive big cars and so on. This is what politics means to those people who have held on to power, those people who control the political parties. And I think the present leadership in the PPP really is the extreme when it comes to that. And we've seen that in clear terms over the last 10 to 12 years. And
I want to just come in here
and
to strengthen the point that you're making.
Right.
I think since the death of the late President Dr. Jagan, I think it is true to say that the more negative forces have now dominated the PPP. And I think one of the sad things about that party is that in trying to run the state all by itself, it had to take on board some of the most discredited Indian elements, both at home and those overseas. And in order to keep up the facade of some amount of multiracial, thing, it have had to deal with the Lumumbas of this world and some of the most negative elements in the African community. So I think you are right in your analysis that the PPP leadership, as it is constituted now, is probably the weakest leadership PPP.
Yes, and so the opposition to power sharing is really based on this thing that they want to hog, this power thing. They don't want anyone to be part of that. Yeah? And you see, if there is power sharing, then there has to be accountability, because there will be different eyes looking on and seeing what's going on. Now, if you run in this government by yourself, you're free to do what you want, and so forth. So part of the opposition to power sharing has to do with this need to hold on to power and not to subject yourself to any kind of scrutiny and accountability on the part of the wider society.
Okay, before we get off of the PPP, I want us to look at a particular personality in the PPP, which I believe has always played an important role in the politics of the PPP. And that person is Mr. Jagan. I think that throughout the history of that party, Janet played a very important political role. And in fact, she have earned the right to play that role.
Yeah.
I mean, that is undisputable. But her politics and her style of politics and her sense of what is important for the country and the party, many people who know her politically believe that sometimes at critical points, she don't play a positive role or as a positive role as she could probably play. I mean, I know you have lived out of Guyana for some time, but I know how the Guyanese community works. Sometimes people are more free to talk in North America than they talk here. Joey Jagan, Janet's son, speak about the Gang of Eight, but unfortunately, he never tell the nation who is the Gang of Eight, name them so that we will have a sense of analyzing the individuals. Now, I want you to give our viewers a judgment of Mrs. Jagan's present role in the PPP. I know you're not an insider, but we have to make judgments based upon our external views of things and the social contact, because this is critical, and I'm only doing it because I think Janet is, to my mind, it's still an important player in what the PPP does.
Yeah, my assessment based on observation of political behavior on the part of the PPP, but also based on conversations that I've had with people close to the PPP, is that Mrs. Jagan continues to be in control of the party. Now, what we have to understand about Mrs. Jagan is that she's a party person. She believes in the paramountcy of the party. She believes further in the paramountcy of the leadership of that party. And she, whatever else she has done over the years, is that she has made sure that the party remains intact and that whatever the party is in, that it is tightly controlled by those who control the decision-making process in the party. So that she has come out of that tradition, what those of us who have observed the old communist tradition will call the Stalinist tradition of tight decision-making and so forth. Unfortunately, that kind of decision-making, that kind of tight control of the party that is operating within a multiracial society, then is translated to control of one race over the other race. So that our behavior within the PPP, this tight control and this thing about the paramountcy about the PPP spills over into a kind of paramountcy of the PPP and Indians over Africans. And I think this is the logical extension that we have to make here. Look, Mrs. Jagan and others of our generation made tremendous contribution to this country. Our independence struggle, or the fact that we won independence and won it in a certain way was due to the struggles of those people. But I dare say that the problem with that generation of leaders is that they did not have the kind of foresight, the kind of vision to take the country from independence to true prosperity and true freedom. And so I think someone like Mrs. Jagan is really counterproductive to the kind of new political culture that we're trying and that is so much needed in a country like Guyana.
Okay, I want to make another point about Mrs. Jagan. It is no secret that the African masses, and particularly the African women in the city, really brought the Janet Jagan government, to its knees.
Yeah.
And I know for a fact that Mrs. Jagan is extremely hurt by the rejection of her presidency by the African Guyanese community in general, and particularly by African women, because she believed that she have done a lot for Guyanese women and she have served the country and that therefore she has a right to the presidency if she's so supported by her party. The big problem that we have there is that, people say that Janet has a profound weakness, that if she's hurt or you hurt her politically, she tries to get even and she tries to hurt you back. I'm hoping that doesn't actually play out in this present situation, because it's going to be very dangerous for the future of the country. What are your views about the possibility of Janet rising above that narrow political interest and behaving different?
I hope she rises above it, because our rejection must be seen in historical terms. And I want to be frank here. As Guyanese, I think we play around with some of these things. I want to be frank. The fact that Mrs. Jagan is white was a big issue. I mean, people try to say all kinds of things. The fact of the matter is that the experiences of African people, whenever Caucasian, white people have been in control of them, have been bad experiences. Slavery, colonialism, and so forth. And so I think black people have a kind of reflexive
automatic
rejection of white leadership. And so therefore, in spite of the fact that Mrs. Jagan has made phenomenal contribution to this country, I think the PPP was somewhat insensitive, and Mrs. Jagan herself should have said no. Oh no, but it shows either a lack of understanding of the historical development of our country and how race has molded our instincts and so on, is either that they simply did not care, and so therefore I would hope that Mrs. Jagan does not see our rejection as a rejection of Mrs. Jagan the person, but to see it in the wider context of race and race relations and the history in this country. The fact that Mrs. Jagan was white played an important role played an important role in our rejection.
I fully agree with that analysis. We have to go to a commercial break just now. And when we come back, we will spend a few minutes looking at the PNC. And then we will try to talk around some of the other issues of power sharing. And then we're going to open the line to callers. So let us go have a commercial break now.
Hey you! Yes, you! Looking for that needed cash? Then remember the name Luther's. Yes, Luther's Worthy Cause Pawn Shop is always willing to help you. We accept as collateral gold jewelry, electrical appliances, motorcycles and other vehicles. Also, remember to walk with valid receipts for all electrical appliances. Motor vehicle documents must be updated, and you must have a valid passport, identification card, or other forms of identification. Come visit our locations at Lot VV Durban Street or 27 Public Road, Vigilance, 4 houses from Vigilance Police Station. Telephone numbers 070-1581-61542. We offer longest payback periods and unbeatable interest rates.
For fabric paste, Sewing World for elastic threads, Sewing World for fabric paints, Sewing World for webbing materials, Sewing World for crochet threads, Sewing World for shoulder pads, Sewing World for fabric transfers, Sewing World for tie-dye fabrics, Sewing World for buttons, buckles, and beads. Sewing World Streets opposite the Acme Photo Studio. It's Sewing World for all your sewing needs.
Africans won their freedom. On Wednesday, August 1st, 2001, all roads would lead to the national park as the African Cultural and Development Association ACTA presents the African Emancipation Festival, featuring local and international groups, children's fun center, folk games, and prizes galore for best African wear. Music by popular DJs and big bands. Adults $500, children $100. Come and enjoy a truly African fun day. Don't you miss it.
Now that you've tried the rest, come and try the Caribbean's best in photo processing at Presidency Enterprise. With our own state-of-the-art and advanced photo system equipment, Presidency Enterprise can produce classic and enlarged prints with special effects optional. Our experienced, qualified, and efficient staff will treat you courteously in our pleasant atmosphere. Our services include instant passport pictures, photo studio, laminating and photocopying, selling of Kodak and Konica films, cameras, batteries, Walkmans, video and audio tapes, telephones, albums, household and gift items. Pressy's Enterprise has 3 locations: 118 Cowan Street, Kingston, telephone 77100 and 77300, 9 America and London Streets, telephone 77802, and 94 Regent Street, telephone 60814. Pressy's Enterprise, the affordable shop where customer satisfaction is guaranteed.
Okay, once again, welcome to the African Perspective. We will be now discussing the PNC and its leadership. But before we come off the PPP, I think it's important for us to recognize, I remember the last time I had Mr. Eric Phillips, a PNC reformer, when we were discussing power sharing. I made some observations on the behalf of AGDA, pointing out that the PPP leadership to date haven't given any clear indication that they have an interest in power sharing. And in fact, the interview was very close to the quarantine protests. And President Jagan went up to quarantine, and he said words to the effect that he will never have the opposition in his government. And I made that point. After that, very recently, the PPP held a Congress. And they put out a statement in which they made certain public pronouncements. I've been trying to get the statement to read it for myself, but we had to go with what the Starbuck News cover. And one of the issues the Starbuck News point out, that the PPP said it is committed to inclusiveness. And I think Mr. Ellis, Brother Ellis, did wrote something in the Starbuck News, drawing recognition to this important development in the PPP. It was short of saying they are committed to power sharing, but it is the first sense that PPP leadership, as it is present constituted, is probably thinking about inclusiveness beyond the present configuration. I think we need to make that observation for what it worked. Now, David, we have to look at the PNC leadership. What is the possibility of the PNC coming fully overboard in support of power sharing, given the way its leadership is constituted?
I think there is more hope within the PNC for coming towards power sharing than within the PPP, because the leadership of the PNC is somewhat a mixed kind of leadership. We have some people who I would refer to as progressives within the PNC, and by progressive I mean people who take a forward-looking view of our problems and how we can solve those problems. And then I think there is the traditional leadership that is steeped in this whole question of power as an end in itself. And I think this is what is holding back the movement towards power sharing within the PNC. That there are still elements within the leadership of the PNC who see power as an end in itself, and who would not see the solution based on a coming together and sharing power equally, but having power and then sharing it out. So I think we have the PNC is in a dilemma, and the dilemma is, I think, to some extent, a refusal on the part of the party to admit, to some extent, that it is an African party, and that it has to, whenever it makes an analysis of where it goes and how it goes forward in terms of Guyana and the future of Guyana, that it must take into consideration the condition of its African supporters.
Okay, Mr. Hoyt is undoubtedly evolved as the most important African Guyanese political leadership at present. I want you to just share with our viewers, very briefly, because you have to watch time.
Yes.
Your assessment of Hoyt politically at this point in time.
I think Mr. Hoyt realizes the important role that he has to play within the black community, but he's in a dilemma. And the dilemma is that he has to satisfy his constituency, the people who vote for the party. But I think Mr. Hoyt is wedded to a certain view of the world, a certain political view of the world. For example, Mr. Hoyt is very big on opposition. You have to have an opposition. So Mr. Hoyt is wedded to that kind of political culture that is based on the kind of Eurocentric, if you will, the kind of systems that were put in place by the British. And so he finds it very difficult to contemplate a solution outside of that framework. I think Mr. White is sensible enough to recognize that there is some need for power sharing, but I think he's not moving to the point where he can contemplate it outside the framework of the present political arrangements.
Okay, so you're saying that his problem really lies in the level of philosophies, political philosophy.
I think so.
Okay,
I think so.
To be a little fair to Mr. Hoyt, as when he announced the dialogue, he did indicate it very clear to the nation, and these are my words, I'm not actually quoting him now, that he said if the PPP, deliver in the dialogue, then it opens the door for more serious consideration of all the other issues.
Yes.
And I think it was his way of saying politically that he will be more disposed to power sharing if he's convinced that the PPP is prepared to make the historic compromise.
Right.
And I've been speaking to people who know Mr. Hoyt and so, and I'm getting the impression that he's coming closer and closer to power sharing. And
I do share that. I do share that sense. Where I disagree with Mr. White is that when you are in a situation where your supporters are under the heels of a developing dictatorship, when your supporters are suffering, when your supporters can't find work, when they can't get contracts, when they can't get loans from the bank, that you have to make some bold decisions. That rather than testing the PPP, is to put the PPP on the line by saying, look, this is where I stand. This is where I stand on power sharing. What says thou?
Okay, I agree with you. I think that would be a more effective tactic.
Exactly.
And that will always be my point in these matters. I want to open the phone to our viewers to participate. But before we do that, I want us to take at least 2 minutes and for you to deal with this question, because we have talked about the political personalities and the parties. But what is the role of the people? What is it? We must say something about the role of the people in all of this, because ultimately, when the parties fail the people, I think ultimately the people have a responsibility, to quote Walter's own words, the self-liberation.
And as a Rodneyite, that is what I urge. I think the most important role in this process is a role that the masses of people must play. And my call to Guyanese people is that to turn inwards, look into yourselves, look into your community, and ask yourself if you want to continue to live the way that you're living. And ask yourself whether you want to continue to be preached to and to be told what you must do, rather than you decide on your own. Decide in your own communities what you want to do, and then tell your leaders that this is where we want to go. So I think that the masses of Guyanese people need to rally in their own communities and provide their own leadership at this particular point in time, which would be a kind of supplement to the leadership that is provided by the political parties.
Okay, well put. Let us have a quick ad break. We go to the ad break, and then when we come back, we will open the phone right away for our viewers to participate in the program.
Their freedom. On Wednesday, August 1st, 2001, all roads would lead to the national park as the African Cultural and Development Association ACTA presents the African Emancipation Festival, featuring local and international groups, children's fun center, folk games, and prizes galore for best African wear. Music by popular DJs and big bands. Adults $500, children $100. Come and enjoy a truly African fun day. Don't you miss it.
Okay, welcome again to African Perspective. We're discussing power sharing. I have with me Dr. David Hinds. I want to open the phone for callers, and so that you could try to come through. I see the phone is ringing. I will try to get this caller through. Caller, good evening. You want African Perspective?
No, we don't. order to get power sharing, we need a constitution that makes that possible. That is a constitution which provides for racial voting and at the same time avoids racial conflict. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. I had made some suggestions to the Constitution Reform Commission for such a constitution. The present population of this country can be easily divided into three groups: Afro-Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese, Amerindians, and others. The others would be the Portuguese, the Chinese, and the few Europeans that we have. Now, those Guyanese of mixed race could be classified under the race of their fathers. Now, under this new constitution, each race group would elect a presidential representative. Now, these three persons would perform the duties of an executive president. They would have equal powers, including the powers to veto. With a basic arrangement like this, every single Guyanese would be represented at the highest decision-making level. The Amerindians would no longer feel left out and discriminated against because they would be at the top tier. Now, each of these three representatives, presidential representatives, would have 7 technocrat advisors.
Okay, I don't want to cut you, but we want to get other people in, and I think you've already made the point. I'm going to give you a minute to tie it up, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Good. Now, the qualifications for each of these technocrats would be at least a master's degree. Now, with these 21 technocrats in place, you have to pay them a salary that is internationally accepted. And I think we can get assistance from the financial institutions to do this. Now, the 10 regions, each of these 10 regions would be represented by 3 persons, one from each race group, regardless as to the number of persons in the region. If you
okay. I think we get the point. We can't keep going on with the full details. So I'm going to. Okay. I think the caller come up with a very creative, solution. As we wait for another call. Okay. Caller, you're on to African Perspective. Hello, you're on to African Perspective. I think we have lost that caller. David, let us try to use the brief moment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think the duty of the role of the African Guyanese in this fight for power sharing is almost self-evident.
Yeah.
Black people feel excluded, they feel more oppressed, whether they're rightly or wrongly, but that is their feeling. Therefore, the line of march is very clear. We have to make an assessment about our Indo-Guyanese brothers and sisters. What is your judgment about the present state of Indian political consciousness as it relates to this power sharing matter?
Yes, I'm very glad you asked this, because I want to make this point about marginalization. I want to say that the vast majority of Guyanese, African Indians, Amerindians, are marginalized, have been historically marginalized. This is the system that we have, where the vast majority of the working people of this country are marginalized. However, African Guyanese, given the fact that they don't hold the state power and that they don't have a big stake and a big share in the economic resources of the country, feel a sense of hopelessness in the situation. Indians, on the other hand, are marginalized, but because of this sense that they hold the political power and that members of their elite control the economic power, they don't feel that sense of hopelessness that Africans feel. They know they're marginalized, but they don't feel that sense of hopelessness. And so therefore, whenever one, in a multiracial society, whenever one group finds itself in a position of privilege, or it feels that's in a position of privilege, it becomes intolerant to the other group. This was so during the PNC days. Africans were intolerant of the feelings of Indians. And I think today Indians generally are intolerant of the feelings of Africans. And what happens then is that intolerance becomes then an end in itself. So Indians feel intolerant of Africans. Africans respond in an intolerant way. And so we have a culture of intolerance.
Okay, I want to remind our callers that you could come in, you could interrupt our discussion, you could come in with your calls, because this is your opportunity to participate in the program. In the meanwhile, we will continue the discussion until somebody indicate that they want to come through. Okay, I want us to look at a new personality that entered the political arena recently, and from the Indo-Guyanese camp, Rafidev and Roro. Mm-hmm. We in AGDA have been looking at this process very carefully, and we have been trying to, to gauge where Rafidev and Roro stands. There's a lot I will probably AGDA want to say about that, but we can't say it in details in this program. We run out of time. But as a political scientist and as a political practitioner, what is the importance of rural intervention at this historical moment?
I think rural intervention is important for a couple of reasons. First is that for the first time, there is a credible or a relatively strong competing force in the Indian community. Part of the thing is that if you look at the Indian community, Dr. Jagan has ruled the roost from the 1950s up until he died, and then the party continues it. Within the African community, there's always been contending forces: the Burnham and the Quayanas, the Burnham and the Rodneys, the Hoyts and the Hamilton Greens, and Clive Thomas, and so on. So there's been much more of a kind of a threat to the sort of establishment in the black community than there has been in the Indian community. So I think Ro brings that to the Indian community. I think Roar also brings to this conversation a kind of honesty, which I think the PNC and the PPP and many other political forces in this country don't think. Roar has said that, look, we're an Indian organization concerned about Indian people. And I have absolutely no problem with that, because I think in multiracial societies that the different race groups have a right and a duty to develop their own institutions, to develop their own consciousness, and to bring that consciousness on the table and merge it with the consciousness and institutions of the other race groups. So in that sense, I think Roar is important. My problem with the Roar intervention, my problem with the Roar intervention is that it invariably, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but the African became the enemy of the Indian. Now, whether this was intentional on the part of Roar, or this is how Roar follows, interpret what Roar was saying, but this is how it had begun to come over, that Africans were the bad ones and so on. I have talked to Mr. Rafidev, and he doesn't come over in that one-on-one with me. I don't live here, and I don't see him on the TV all the time and so forth. But this is the problem that I have with Roar. And I think that given some of the statements that I've seen coming out from the organization, that they're cognizant of this problem. Because you see, if you try to develop an Indian consciousness based on this feeling that Africans are the enemy, you're not doing any business. You're really turning back the hands of the clock. Similarly, I would take the same position if AGDA were to take a position that Indians are the enemy. Okay? I think the enemy of African people and the enemy of Indian people is a historical political culture that has relegated these two groups to marginal status and put them to fight against each other and let them think that they're enemies.
An inadequate political system.
An inadequate political system. And the power sharing seeks to create the kind of environment where Indians and Africans can honestly sit down and work out their political differences in an atmosphere of cordiality. You see, power sharing is not meant, as some people would have you believe, to solve our racial problems. The solution to our racial problems is a generation thing. It will take a long time, okay? What we, however, want to do is to say, we have our racial differences, but let's iron those racial differences out, not in an acrimonious atmosphere, but let's do it in an atmosphere of collective intervention. Let's do it in an atmosphere of compromise. Let us do it in an atmosphere of consensus, okay? So that we come to the table and we say, this is what I bring, this is what you bring, this is how I feel, this is how you feel. Let us talk knowing that I am not threatening you, you are not threatening me. That the power that we're trying to negotiate, both of us sit there and we're going to determine how this power is going to be distributed.
And that's basically AGDA position. You see, AGDA takes the position that African people have to be responsible for their own self-liberation. We start with that position. In the process of executing our liberation, we don't want to dominate nobody. We want to guarantee our Indo-Guyanese brothers and sisters out there that AGDA is not for domination. We want to guarantee our Amerindian brothers and sisters and other Guyanese that we are not interested in domination. At the same time, we will not accept the domination of any other race over our people. I mean, our sacrifice in this society in slavery and colonialism makes it almost impossible for us to contemplate the acceptance of any political system that excludes us out of political power indefinitely, and economic and social arrangements which marginalize us to insignificance. We will not compromise on that, and we try to make this extremely clear.
And I agree with that position. I think, look, Ogun, I think that Africans have a duty to ensure the safety and the security of Indians, and Indians have a duty to ensure the security and the safety of Africans. How do you do that? You do that by creating a culture within your own race group of tolerance. And that tolerance will come from a consciousness of self. If I may talk specifically about Africans, because as an African person, I feel strongly about the condition of African people. I think what is lacking among African people, we have an indignation against the system. We have an indignation against the Indian government. We have, I think, a wayward indignation against Indian people as a whole. What we don't have is an indignation about the self-destruction that we are carrying out within our community. I think that we have to turn our face sternly against a culture that says that we do not have it within us to rise above this adversity, that we do not have it within us to produce the kind of skills and the kind of attitude that is needed to liberate us. So that I think African people, rather than burning tires, I think should begin to sit down in their community and to ask ourselves, how have we arrived at this point where we've got to burn tires? Is it purely an external enemy, or do we have an enemy within? And I think we've got to identify that enemy within and work to get rid of that enemy within. Consciousness is important. A dedication to self is important. That African people must see themselves as African people. That they must have a consciousness of themselves as African people. That they must understand that they come from a heritage, they come from a history that is full of great things. That here in Guyana, that African people contributed tremendously to the humanization of this society. And so therefore, we must not contribute to the dehumanization of the society. We must contribute towards holding that humanization. And one of the things that we have to do in the African community is hold our leaders accountable.
Okay, I agree. You ran out of time. You're coming very close to unfortunately, to our, I'm closing in time. I want to make this point. You see, we in AGDA believe that the people who try to oppress another people is yourself, imprisoning yourself. If you try to oppress a people, you have to put into place the mechanism to keep them in that oppression, and in so doing, you oppress yourself. Therefore, in this new configuration, we are honestly and seriously fighting for a solution which will allow all Guyanese to prosper and to live in unity, based, as we said, on the principle of equality and parity. You're my guest, and I want to give you the last minute.
I want to make an appeal to Guyanese people that our country has reached the point where it will go under or it will survive. And whether it survives or it goes under will be determined largely by the choices that we, the ordinary people, make. Leaders will lead, but people must determine the conditions and the atmosphere in which those leaders lead. That we've got to go back to the drawing board. We've got to sit down in our communities and we've got to plan. We've got to plan for our own security and we've got to plan for the security of the entire nation. We've got to plan for our own prosperity and we've got to plan for the prosperity of the entire nation. Now is the time when Guyanese people must rediscover what Walter Rodney calls your power, people's power. We must rediscover our power to make choices, our power to take those choices and to make them have an impact on the collective situation. Emancipation is a time when Africans will remember that we won the struggle against slavery. Emancipation must be a time when we talk about how we can emancipate ourselves as individuals, but ourselves as a collective group. And so therefore, my challenge to Guyanese people, Africans and Indians, that now is the time that you must begin to turn your face sternly against the backwardness that we've been practicing these last 3 years especially.
Okay, well said. I do hope that our viewers enjoy our program tonight. It's a very political program. We're sorry that we couldn't really get the kind of participation we wanted. But I think the discussion was well. Once again, on behalf of the African Cultural Development Association, welcome to the African Perspective. I am your host, Tacuma Ogunseye. Good evening until next week. Thank you, Dr. Hinds.
And thank you, Ogun, for inviting me
to the program.